Let's have a look at Europe. So here you have in the bars the cumulative adding up month by month imports of cashew kernels into the European Union plus the UK. And those are compared to the lines, same numbers for 2020, 2022 and 2023. I've left 2021 out deliberately. So what we see here is that really positive trend, slow start in January, and since then it's picked up. Imports for the 5 months for the whole region up by 6.6%. Again, we're looking at low contracted prices, any inventory that remains. And by the way, I don't think there is much inventory lying in Europe unsold. But if it's there, it's low priced inventory. Similar to North America, 2022 actually looked better than this, more than 6% up, and then demand crashed. I'm not saying it will, not by any means. But what I am saying is it can happen. So we do need to keep an eye on this. Question is, what will the impact of higher prices be? What will the impact of defaults be on the one side? And then on the other side, what will the impact be of an improving economy in Europe? Some very positive numbers were released yesterday on European economic growth for 2024. What will the impact have been in consumption of cashews by the Euros, football championships, and of course by the Olympic Games, both of which may well boost consumption of snacks in Europe. We should also look, as we did earlier, we should look again at the monthly change in imports, because what I'm looking for here is there any evidence that rather than taking more cashews, they just took them earlier in a response to some of the disruption or potential disruption to shipments due to the conflict in the Gulf, general delays, the problems with the Suez Canal. And it does look as if there may well be. So we see a big spike in the month of March. So a big growth in imports in the month of March. So that would have been decisions that might have been made in January or early February in terms of shipments. So if someone said, look, ship my March and April contracts as soon as possible, we'll take them in, we'll pay for them, that would impact in March. So you see big growth February, March, and then very little and even a decline in May. So overall 6.6% up, but the trend is waning a little bit in Europe. And this may be due to the impact of a decision to accelerate shipments. And that pattern, to me, does suggest that there were some earlier shipments taken. So the actual underlying demand may not be as positive as the initial 5-month statistics would suggest. What is positive is the change in African imports into Europe. So we look at market share. I'm just reflecting back 2020 for the full year. African processors had a 7% share of the European market. In 2023, that had expanded to 17.1%. And for the first 5 months of 2024, it's just under 22%. So that is pretty remarkable. Compared to 8.5% share of the US market, this is fantastic progress for African cashew processing and real indications that the development of processing in Africa is here to stay and that European buyers at least are supporting that. Where does it come from? Well, dominated by Côte d'Ivoire. 61% of imports of African cashew kernels into Europe in the first 5 months of 2024 were from Côte d'Ivoire. There were also increases from Tanzania. There were increases from Nigeria, Ghana, and from Benin. But as you can see from the table, these countries, although increasing, are relatively small providers compared to Côte d'Ivoire. All positive news in that sense, And I think that we are at last seeing something of a breakthrough for African exports of cashew kernels to the European market. It has an impact on processing in Africa. So I thought we'd have a quick look at this. So this is, you will have seen this before. This is our 2023 processing capacity in various countries in West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and Burkina Faso. They've added processing capacity either in existing or in new factories over the last 6 months or so. 15,000 tons added in Ghana, 20 in Nigeria, possibly more. But that will scale up over time. 45,000 in Cote d'Ivoire. Again, it'll take time to scale up. 40,000 in Benin. In 2024, new factories opened in 6 African countries. And we're talking about substantial factories. We're talking about mechanized, large-scale factories. Unfortunately, in many of these same countries, factories also closed, either temporarily or, sadly, in some cases, permanently. And it's right across the region as well. So Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Benin, factories where some of them closed temporarily. Of course, almost every factory that closes initially closes temporarily, and it's only over time that that becomes permanent. But there's a worrying trend. There is expansion, but there's also factories closing or suspending their operations at the same time. Generally speaking, broad picture is positive progress on processing in Africa. Let's have a look at prices. More to record the prices than to comment on where they might go. So what we've seen so far this year is a little bit of a roller coaster. We've seen prices up, not a lot of business was done, very high levels, crashed back down, and they've settled for the time being. There is a little bit of buying going on at the moment, but it doesn't seem to be moving prices. Some of the cheaper offers are getting taken out. But generally speaking, the market looks quite steady. It means that most, and these are critical things looking forward, most forward sales are still below today's market. Most inventory is below today's market. This means that market prices are likely to be quite sensitive in the coming months. They may go up, they may go down, but they are quite likely to move. Prices are not high historically. Yes, we have seen a big increase from these very low levels over a long period, but we are only 14% above the 5-year average. And we're 8% below the 5-year high. And these 5 years have not been a period of high prices. So it's kind of interesting. And just to put it in perspective, today on the 31st of July, 2024, we are at exactly the same price for 320s as we were on the 1st of August, 2014, 10 years ago. Given everything that's happened, given the costs, given the huge price bubble, that says a lot. And it does actually go to show just how difficult this business can be at times. So, looking at prices throughout the year, looking at RCN prices, RCN has been volatile this year. Prices started at last year's levels, and then they dipped on forecasts of a good crop, and then we saw it's just gone up and up. But we should bear in mind that effectively prices have moved up and they've come back, but they are actually a little bit higher for comparison purposes because generally speaking this year, quality is lower. So same price for lower quality is effectively a price rise. What is happening is that a premium is emerging for a float material, in other words, material that's close to hand. That unfortunately encourages contract default, but it is a fact and it is an indicator. And what we're also seeing is that the premiums for higher quality are widening. So the gap between a £49, if you can find one, and a £46 is getting bigger because there's less and less good quality material available. As it stands, the current raw cashew nut prices, they do work for efficient processors versus today's kernels market. Now, efficient means you got your costs under control, you're managing your factory well, and all those factors. But they certainly do not work against past sales. And as we've said, all forward sales are below today's market. So you've got this problem. It's you buy RCN to execute an old sale, you're going to lose money. You buy it today to make a new sale, you could make a profit. Processors continue to struggle. They struggle with higher costs. And we see that in India. We see increasing wages. We see increasing costs of logistics. We see higher freight costs. And most of all, we see this problem for processors of executing forward sales when they're not receiving the raw cashew nuts that either they expected or that they contracted for. So this is reducing in a delay in shipments of kernels. It's reducing processing. And it's therefore could in the second half of the year and certainly in 2025 could have an impact on demand. So whilst we look at kernels prices, they are sustainable from a demand perspective. People will still continue to buy cashews at these prices. But RCN prices are not sustainable based on what's already happened and the current prices. So on the contracts that are already made and the current prices. So what is happening is that processors who sell and then buy their raw cashew nuts later are in a difficult position, which accounts for a lot of processors. So you have a system that demands that processors sell forward in order to get business. They need business because they need contracts, because they need finance. Then they're into that situation when the market goes up. They either have to renegotiate, they have to make some new sales to try and average, and in some cases, they may well go out of business. In others, in markets where they don't sell forward, they tend to reduce the processing capacity. And we're seeing a little bit of that in India. So it wouldn't be at all surprising that 2024 results in an increase in the speed of rationalization in the cashew processing sector. Final segment, policy and regulation. Let's have a look at some of the things that have happened in the first part of 2024. Major changes. Cambodia introduced a policy to improve the quality of its raw cashew nuts and to improve value addition in the cashew sector. That policy was signed into law at the end of January and it's currently under implementation. In Benin, we saw the ban on exports continue through the year. In Ghana, we've seen significant regulatory development with the Tree Crops Development Authority. We've seen registration of stakeholders, control of who can buy at the farm gate, and possibly a window for processors to source their products. In Cote d'Ivoire, we've talked much about the export ban mid-season. In Guinea-Bissau, we've seen significant action to encourage and enforce legal export compared to previous years where the product was moved across the border into Senegal, into the Gambia. These are just 5 examples. There are others, but certainly governments have taken a much greater interest in the cashew sector in recent years. They have been successful in some cases and not in others, but we are looking at the prospect of further government intervention. Let's have a look in a little bit more detail and some of the impacts of government policy. We'll start in Benin, where exports were banned and that ban was maintained throughout the season. That has caused a huge spike in illegal cross-border trade, export by land into Togo, Nigeria, and so on. Processing has increased, make no mistake, but sourcing of raw nuts by the organisation responsible for the GDIZ processors or by individual processors for their own use has not really been as successful as it might have been. They tell me that only 45,000 tonnes has been procured, way below capacity, and a disappointing result for the year. So processors are struggling. Now, this leaves a situation where coming into 2025, we will not have a minimum farm gate price under current regulation. We will have an export ban under current regulation. This leaves farmers in Benin very vulnerable to lower farm gate prices. And we're not talking about wealthy people here. We're talking about some of the smallest, some of the poorest farmers on the planet. And they will be vulnerable in 2025 unless this system is somehow retuned. In Côte d'Ivoire, we saw the export suspension, and its impact has been the lower quality of raw cashew nuts because the infrastructure isn't there to hold the raw cashew nuts whilst the ban is in place. An increase in the cross-border trade, mainly into Ghana. And probably the biggest impact is a negative impact on the reputation of the country, a negative impact on the reputation of the cashew sector in Côte d'Ivoire as a destination. So today, in Côte d'Ivoire, they're having a close look at how their sector was managed in recent years. They're having a close look at how the sector can be managed in the future. And there's no doubt that this kind of policy volatility is definitely going to damage reputation because people are going to wonder, well, if they change one thing, will they change another thing? Looking forward into 2025, and given what's happened this year, would you buy forward from Côte d'Ivoire? Would you buy forward on the basis that your contract may be delayed by 2 months or 3 months? Would you pay 10% in advance for something that you don't know when it's going to get shipped? It's a big question, and I think that forward contracting, or the risk of forward contracting not taking place, is a major risk for the country for the 2025 crop. And of course, it has an impact because a lot of the working capital, a lot of the finance, a lot of the money advanced into the sector is dependent on forward contracting of raw cashew nuts. Again, I suspect that this export suspension, which has gone on much longer than was expected, and I do understand that the CCA would like to remove it, but I think they're still waiting for general agreement on that, and 50 days have passed since the lifting of the first stage. I think it could cast a long shadow over the sector. More positively, in Guinea-Bissau, changes to the system have allowed better access at the farm gate, reduction in taxation, or at least a restructuring of taxation. This has reduced the illegal trade cross-border. It's not illegal from Senegal point of view, it is illegal from Guinea-Bissau point of view, that the percentages that will be exported through the port of Bissau will be much higher this year than last year. There will be an improved tax revenue as a result, and of course that will, you would expect, build some confidence in the sector in Guinea-Bissau. Quite positive changes. It is a volatile market, it is a volatile economy. Let's hope that those positive moves continue. In Ghana, the new regulatory framework with registration of actors, I think, has contributed to lower volatility of prices at the farm gate. Prices did move up and down, but the margin was less. The time of volatility was less this year. It does seem to have worked to a certain extent. Processors are now engaged, and I think we may be looking at a new era in the Ghanaian cashew sector if this regulatory approach can be properly implemented, and signs so far are really good. So we've looked across a whole range of things. We've looked at production, we've looked at demand and processing, we've looked at the raw cashew nut trade, prices, policy and regulation in 2024. And what we've seen is a really volatile year. Volatility is not great for business. So the second half of this year is going to be critical. What are some of the key points that we need to look at? So on production, yes, production is lower, but it's not unmanageably lower in terms of the overall supply and demand. The final outturn of Indian production is now a key factor. This is certainly something, if those estimates are right, of 20% or more less of a crop, it is going to have an impact. And that'll be the impact that determines the second half of the year. In terms of demand and processing, cashew kernels price levels are sustainable at the current levels. Significant RCN buying is still to be done, but I don't see it sustaining higher prices for now. The disruption to the market certainly could undermine demand growth this year, and this is something we need to look at. We've had quite a difficult first half of the year. Generally, volatility, difficult times discourages buyers from further demand growth. I think we're going to see further processor rationalization in India, in Vietnam, and in Cote d'Ivoire. I think we will see some smaller, less well-established, less competitive factories closing, going out of business, being absorbed by larger units. And I think that process will take some years. Processing overall will probably continue to grow, but it will grow in a different way than it has done in the past. Some of the impacts then of what we've seen over the first half of the year, I think that this regulatory conundrum in Cote d'Ivoire may cast a long shadow over both the Ivorian cashew sector and cause some reputational damage to the West African cashew sector generally. I think the defaults and delays on raw cashew nuts and kernels are certainly, and I mean this in the broadest sense, not just about Africa or Cote d'Ivoire, but generally undermining the reputation of the cashew sector. You know, if you're an American buyer and you can get a truckload of almonds from California in a couple of weeks, reliably, at a fixed price, or buy a truckload of cashews from 10,000 miles away or 3,000 miles away and maybe get it or maybe not, or maybe get it later or maybe not get it later, or maybe the quality is good or maybe it's not, that has definitely got an impact on your decision. So that is a key factor. It's happened in the past. It's happening now. We need to address this. But to finish on a positive note, I think that from an African processor's point of view, 2024 has been an opportunity. It is an opportunity. We see that in increases in market shares, up to 8.5% share of the US market, January to May 2024, up to 22% share of the EU market. Really positive numbers, and that it's a real opportunity for African processors. What a year. What an interesting time to be in the cashew business. I hope you've enjoyed our perspective. I look forward to your questions. The
first question is more about the overall crop estimates for West Africa and how it compares with 2023. I know that you've talked about the fact that there is, in terms of the overall estimate, 10% down from last year. And in terms of kernel, 13% down. But what are the actual figures?
I'm sorry, Ernest, I lost you there for a moment. Okay, so the figure comes in at exactly 10% down. I'm just looking at my database here.
What is the actual figure compared to that of last year? That is what the customer wants to know, yes.
Well, by my estimates, this year is 2.247 and last year was 2.536 million. That figure is an RCN figure, so yeah.
The follow-up question is, why is this not translated into high RCN prices?
but it is. I mean,
did you get that, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, it
Hello,
is
Jim?
translated. It is translated into RCN prices. Let's have a look at our.
Yes.
Let's see if we can get
the question now. Because actually what you presented at some point was the prices are slightly down in 2024.
No.
So might be the question. So maybe you can clarify that a bit. How this 10% drop in RCN volumes, which is also translating in 13% in terms of kernel, how is it impacting?
Okay, so let's just go one question at a time. So first of all, look at the chart. I don't think that says that RCN prices are down. It pretty clearly shows RCN prices are up. What I said was they went up and then they came down a little bit later. They're off the highs. That's the first thing. The second factor is, okay, so let's say if you said that West African raw cashew nuts were an average outturn of, let's say, 48 pounds. And let's say this year we said the average outturn, because we got to weigh it heavily in favor of the major volume origins, Cote d'Ivoire and so on. So let's say the average was 48. That means that you lose about 9% of the crop. So that means that the outturn yield is affected by 9%. And that's the way you do it. So if we took all of the origins, we would have to factor in the yield factor for each one. So Ghana might have been normally 50 pounds. We might be taking 49 this year. Cote d'Ivoire, we might normally take 47, and this year we might take 45, and that has an impact. And that's how you say that the kernels will be less. But in order to be precise on that, we would have to go in country by country, and maybe we'll do that one of these days. But for now, we're estimating that will add an additional reduction in available kernels of about 2.5 to 3%.
Then the next question is on Vietnam, and that if the RCN stock availability is low or tightened, you're talking about 2.5 months stock. What should we expect in Tanzania? Is there going to be a rush of Vietnamese buyers?
No, I see. This is the point, right? So it's very easy to make the conclusion.
Tanzania in the upcoming.
Ernest, I'm not sure if it's your end or my end, but I'm losing the end of each question. So I think you're asking me about Tanzania. And
yes, Tanzania, and whether we will have a lot of Vietnamese buyers rushing to that.
I don't think so, because in actual fact, the Tanzanian raw material would arrive too late. So Tanzanian raw material can be a bridge between 2024 crop and 2025 crop, but there's a couple of points. First of all, Tanzanian raw material, generally speaking, is higher priced than other origins because of its quality. Secondly, the Indian buyers tend to favor Tanzanian raw material, but I do not think that people will rush into the auction in Tanzania early, simply because they look at it and they'll say, well, let's see how our demand is. Let's see how these higher prices have impacted. So even if you enter the auction, let's say on the 20th of October, you won't see that product in your factory until probably January processing. So that means that there is unlikely to be a rush into Tanzania for reasons of 2024 crop reduction. By then, the problem will either be resolved or not. So I don't expect a big rush into Tanzania.
There are a couple of questions on India, but before we go there, the question here on quality is, what is the quality of RCN nuts in Cambodia? And again, for West Africa, is it the case that this whole low quality is due only to climate change? And what are the measures being put in place to address that?
The quality of cashews from Cambodia is generally high outturn, very large nuts. So you are looking, the most interesting characteristic about Cambodian raw cashew nuts is the size. So you're looking at counts 160 is common, 140 is regular. So you're looking at very large nuts. They are relatively high outturn, 50, 51, even higher in some cases. There may be some question marks about the peeling characteristics of Cambodian nuts. The M23 variety, which is the driver of this surge in production, accounts for about 60% of the plantings in Cambodia. There may be some questions about its peeling characteristics. And that means that sometimes the Cambodian nuts tend to head for the markets which take the unpeeled kernels. But generally speaking, high quality. In terms of the second part of the question, there's no doubt that the quality of raw cashew nuts this year has suffered as a result of the weather and climatic conditions during the growing season. And there's no doubt that those conditions were impacted by climate change, and therefore it looks like these problems are here to stay. What we can do about them, and most countries have identified these factors, but they're struggling to implement the improvements. So, for example, better post-harvest handling, earlier, better drying, better storage, better education of farmers, research into varieties which are more drought resistant. As someone said at one of those African Cashew Alliance conferences in recent years, forgive me whoever said it, I can't remember who it was right now, but cashew trees are resilient and drought resistant, but the yields that they give are not. And therefore we will see decreasing yields if we don't do something about it. So what should be done is pretty well identified in terms of improved varieties, better management, and some of those interventions are quite simple. Similarly with the post-harvest interventions, but in many cases they haven't been widely implemented across the sector. So the answer to the problem has been to plant more trees, but there's a limit to the number of trees you can plant. There's a limit to the number of trees that you take out to plant new trees. And therefore we need to look at not more trees, but better practices on farms. And I think in many cases that's well identified. It's a question of implementation now.
Thank you very much, Jim. Now let me move on to India, the questions on India, before I get to policy. And there is information that 3 major producing centers in India are currently on strike for all of August to reduce supply and control declining prices of kernels. So what do you think the impact of this could be on raw cashew and kernel market in India? Did you get the question well?
Yes, it did.
And sorry, our listeners, for the poor internet access that I think I'm having at my end. And once Jim can get a question, then he should answer them properly for us. Thank you very much, Jim.
Sorry, Ernest, can you give me that question again, please?
So what I'm saying is that the information that we have in the Q&A is that 3 major producing centers in India are currently on strike for all of August to reduce supply and control declining prices of kernels. And what do you think the impact of this will be on the raw cashew nut and kernel markets of India?
Well, I referred to that throughout the presentation, and I said that processing capacity in India would be reduced.
Could you in the next for the next question also, it's saying that in India the stock calculation slide, what is your estimated cashew kernel quantity for local consumption per month? Are you tracking local consumption per month also?
No.
Of course, India is purely fully locally consumed, So you may have some estimation there, but the question is, are you tracking local consumption in India per month?
Yes, I'm tracking local consumption in India.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we are losing a bit of the text because of the internet, but you have given the estimates for January to July for India in terms of RCN arrival. And the Sakar here wants to know what is the estimated arrival for India from July to December? Do you have any estimated arrivals for RCN?
I'll take it. I'll take it as a compliment that people are asking me to predict the future. What I said is that there is a potential for India to buy an additional 650,000 tons of raw cashew nuts by my calculations. So in addition to the 385, so there's 385 to the end of May, plus whatever was imported in June. So let's say 130. And let's say the top estimate is 650, which would give us an import for 2024 of 1.17 million tons.
Okay. So Jim, the next question also is on policy, but maybe before we go to policy, the question here I have is that you have presented Vietnam and India import consumption and balance details from January to which month? I think to July. That's what you did?
June.
Okay. So Bhupendra, it's from January to June. That's a question. But we had Mr. Bade from Senegal who was asking what ACA and CICC are doing to address the export bans in Cote d'Ivoire and Benin, and so that the informal cross-border trades can be reduced. I think for us in this CICC and ACA, we have worked together as partners and addressed a lot of these issues and also engaged government. But a key issue is also to look at the policy intentions. The policy intentions behind some of these cross-border bans and the ban on export has been two. One, to promote domestic processing, and secondly, to also manage and retain some kind of domestic income by way of taxes. But I think for us, the big issue has to do more with the predictability of these policies. So this is where, if you take the case of Benin, it was already announced in 2022 that there will be a ban. But Cote d'Ivoire, as Jim rightly puts it, it's been more ad hoc. And I think this is something that we will have to engage more with the CCA to make sure that next year it's more predictable. People should know what they are confronted with before even the start of the year in terms of policies, and especially with the ban. And then hopefully we can address some of the reputational damages that are likely to occur. So I think this is what explanation I will give here to Bobby from Senegal, and also to thank him for his participating in the forum. Jim, did I come out clearly?
We could hear you very well, Ernest.
Okay, very good. So now the other question is still back now to Vietnam, and they are wondering whether Vietnam really could have 2.5 months stock, given the late crop and the huge IBC shipment yet to arrive. So here, I mean, it's more doubting the figure, whether indeed there is even anything like 2.5 months stock in Vietnam.
Yeah, but you gotta be realistic here. Now, a lot of people are trying to boost the price of RCN, right? And I can hear a lot of the questions are phrased to do that. And I'm not interested in speculators, and I'm not interested in speculative type questions, right? That's really important. So if you think you can increase the value of your RCN on this webinar, forget about it. Number one. Number two, there's no impact of the ban in Ivory Coast, in Vietnam yet. None. The ban came in on the 11th of May. Our figures are up to the 15th of June. Anything that arrived was already shipped. And if you look at the presentation, you'll see, let me bring you back to it. So here's the imports. In 2023, the volumes of imports came in July and August. The import volume in the first half, in June of 2024 was the same in Vietnam as it was in June of 2023. So as at the end of June, there was no impact of the ban. The ban, which was implemented early in May, can only affect arrivals from July onwards. So the figures we've presented are up to the 15th of July. And therefore, it's highly likely. I would say 2.5 months might even be on the low side. It is quite possible if you just add up your numbers. If you think of the basics, what was your opening stock? What was your crop? What were your imports? These are known figures. No dispute on these figures. These are not estimates. These are statistics. Imports of Burma kernels, statistics. Exports, statistics. Domestic is not a statistic. It's an estimate, but it's a tiny proportion of the number, less than 5%. So if you add up the numbers, that's what you get.
Okay.
Now, how could that vary? Well, if Vietnamese customs didn't know their figures and they got their imports wrong or their exports wrong, it could be different. If the opening stock, which could be the case, if the opening stock was higher, then it'd be more than 2.5 months. So we're not talking here about, I'm not saying this figure is absolutely correct, but we're not talking about guesswork. We're talking about just using the available numbers to calculate what the situation is. Now, if there was more opening stock, then it's more than 2.5 months. So you can't say, and this is a big problem in our industry. People say, oh, the shipments were late, it was a late year, it must be a worse situation. But all they're doing is talking their book. So, and this is a situation which is continually arising in our industry. People prefer to talk their own book and their own interest than to actually identify the real numbers and the reality. And that is really bad for business. I can't tell you how bad that is for business. You can imagine an investor looking at an industry that doesn't have numbers. They go somewhere that does have numbers, wouldn't they? So when we talk about the 2.5 months, we're talking about a calculation based on figures. If you don't agree with the figures, that's a different matter. If you don't agree with the imports or the crop, if you don't agree with the exports, they're all a discussion. But based on the numbers, that's what you get. So to say it couldn't be says more about an individual's way of thinking than it does about the reality. So yes, it could be wrong. But which number is wrong? That's what we should be discussing. Not, it couldn't be that. Because, well, gee, it doesn't suit me that it's that. Anyway, 2.5 months is nothing. This is the other point. See, if you think like a trader, you go 2.5 months, I'm not going to get an order for 2.5 months. That's not good news. I won't be able to get the price up. But if you think like an industrialist, you go 2.5 months inventory is not a lot of inventory. Not when I've got to transform that and ship it and get paid for it before I return that cash into my system. So
thank you very much, Jim. The last question, Jim. Hi,
yeah.
Jim.
Yeah.
Last question. It's from Sri Rama, who is saying that 2.56 million tons West African crop estimate for 2023 season looks underestimated, and that actual landings in India and Vietnam are much higher and it indicates more than 3 million ton crop from West Africa in now he says 2023 season. So it's not so clear though. But he's saying 2.56 million ton is underestimated.
So the total landing into the two countries in the year was 3.9 million tons. That included stock that was held in transit, stock that was afloat, shipped from the 2022 crop. 3.9 million tons includes Cambodia, East Africa, Indonesia. Includes all transit stock, of which there was about 300,000 tons. So you do need to dig into the numbers a little bit to try to understand them. If you want to do that, come on with us, come on to the seminar one day and we'll discuss it. Again, this thing of throwing out numbers, INC says this, INC says that. Come on. I'm going to suggest to you that you have a look at some of the questions that are arising. Look at key things. How much is India's crop down by? Now, I'm saying down by because I think it's almost certain it's lower than last year, but how much is it lower? Big question. How will buyers, especially in India and in China, respond to these higher prices that we're seeing? Will we see good buying, particularly, and it should happen around about now, from China for the autumn festival at these higher prices? It'll be interesting to see what's happening on the Côte d'Ivoire export ban. Why has it not been lifted? When will it be lifted? When will the remaining stock get shipped for export? Big question, but over a longer period of time, how big is the crisis in processing in RCN importing countries? We hear a lot from India. We hear a lot from Vietnam of the difficulties. How big is that problem? It's not the first time. I've talked about a rationalization. I expect to see that happen. How big is the crisis? That'll determine how quickly the rationalization happens. And then finally, we'll move on. By the end of the month, we'll be looking at East Africa and how are the East African crops looking. So we might start the next session by having a look at Southern Hemisphere cashew producing countries. We'll have a look at their likely production, structures of the markets, and we might even be lucky enough to get one or two guests on from perhaps Mozambique and Tanzania to chat to us about the prospects for the 2024 crop. Thank you everyone for joining us as always. This was the 70th. Can you believe that? This was the 70th GME. The picture you see on the screen is of traders in Germany negotiating and testing the quality of commodities almost 500 years ago. So this has been going on for a long time. I don't think there was any cashews there. Thanks, everyone. See you next time. Take care of yourself.